I'm going to be doing something just a little bit different. I'm going to be reacting to an interview with Paul McCartney, and I believe the interview was conducted in September of 2005 with BBC Music. So I'm just going to be listening, and you guys can follow along with me, and sort of just giving a bit of an analysis of what Paul McCartney's talking about, maybe just see what's of interest and if we can gain anything useful or just interesting from his interview. The interview is described as Paul McCartney reveals his songwriting secrets to BBC Radio. Quote unquote, sold on song. So let's take a listen. It was recorded at Abbey Road Studios.
I'm always writing. It's a hobby. And I don't think of what I'm going to write about. To me, it sort of spoils the magic of what I do. Yeah. So I don't often come to writing a song with much of an idea. There may be a title, or maybe just a phrase, or just a thought I've had. But I hardly ever come to it with much more than that. And I don't really come to it thinking, oh, I'm going to write a bunch of sad songs, or I'm going to write a bunch of happy songs, because that would get a bit boring. You know, I'd like to write a happy one and then I'm bored with that and sort of sad one. So there's no method really. And I think if I work at it, it's to work at not having a method.
I mean, do you get snatches of tunes that come to you that you have to...
Okay, so I found this interesting because he talks about how he doesn't really necessarily go into a song with an idea. He might just have a phrase he mentions, or just one little, I think he still has an idea, it's just not, he's not trying to force that idea. So it might just start with a phrase, like he said, or maybe just like a little lyric, or even just a word. And I think that's interesting because he's trying to not have a method. And he just kind of goes with whatever makes sense in that moment.
Come into a dictaphone so you keep those in store, or do you hold them in your head?
I do a bit of that, but they don't tend to be the good ones.
Right.
You know, so I've got cassettes with millions of snatches of tunes, but that's where they stay.
Right.
On this little cassette. But normally I'll come and I'll sit down and I'll start strumming something I fancy, doing, either a key that I fancy playing around in.
Always on the guitar first, is it?
No, or on piano.
Right, yeah.
I strum a piano as well. And just see where I go to first. Yeah. Just see where it leads me. It's how we always did it. Yeah. I would sit down with John.
Yeah, so this is something I can relate to in the sense that when I write a song, I usually just sit down and start and just sort of see where it goes. And I think, for me at least, this is one of the best methods of songwriting because it's kind of a lot more natural and fun. You can kind of experiment and just sort of be in the moment of making the music versus trying to plan it all out and have like very specific ideas. I think there's people that can do that and they can do it successfully, but I don't know if that's necessarily always good. Not to label it as good or bad, but I think what he's just saying is that the best songs that he's written just sort of happened. It just sort of came in the moment. And another thing that he talked about is having all these little recordings of song ideas. I think that's interesting too because I've talked a bit about this, how when you're in the songwriting process, there's going to be little ideas that aren't so good, or maybe they're just sort of like little sketches of songs, little doodles, little recordings. And yeah, I think it's normal to just have a collection of those and not really be using them, but at the same time, I don't really want to delete them because like maybe there could be something useful, or it's just interesting to see. But I think that those little recordings that he makes even though he might not go back and listen to them again or actually use them, I think it's part of the process. Like, it's your brain sort of working through the music and working through ideas. So it's not necessarily a bad thing.
And we would just sort of follow this road.
Right.
You know, it's like, okay, well, that would...
So you never write a full formal lyric as a poem on a paper?
No, just write it as I go along.
Yeah.
First verse, second verse, middle eight, third verse. And just try and get to the end in one go. That's normally then pretty much written.
Right.
You've got your melody, your words, your middle, and then you may then look at it and just sort of think, oh, that line's a bit ropey, or a bit, you know, I should change that. But if you're lucky, more often than not, you know, you suddenly find you've just sort of done it. And I think because John and I developed this way of doing it, I mean, literally, we used to get rung up. I mean, we're in Abbey Road now doing this.
Yeah.
And we would get rung up by Brian Epstein. And he'd say, right, chaps, you've got the week off next week because you're in the studio the week after and I'd like you to write the album.
Right.
And we go, oh, yeah. Hey! You know, like, that was like, wow, week off.
Yeah.
And we never looked at it like, what? Write an album in a week? It was more like, yeah, that's a good idea. So, I mean, every day John and I sat down to write.
What, opposite each other with an acoustic guitar?
Two acoustics,
Yeah.
me left-handed, him right-handed,
Yeah.
sort of looking at each other as if it was like in a mirror, both playing the same chords. We didn't get too fancy, you know, we just both played the chords. We would start off like I've just sort of described. We started with some sort of idea, roughly, get a first verse, and then bounce off each other. So by the time we'd done 2 or 3 hours, which is normally our attention span, we had a little sheet of with lyrics written down on it, and we just had to remember the tune. There was no such things as cassettes, you know,
Right, yeah.
or you know, anything to put it down on. So you just had to remember it, which we ended up thinking that was actually a good thing.
What were some of the songs you can remember writing very...
Okay, so that's interesting. He talks about how him and John weren't recording anything down really. They might just record the lyrics, but they would have to remember the actual music, the song, the tune. Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to go about writing. Because, well, I do that as well. So, like, often I'll be writing a song and there are a lot of songs I've written where I've never actually written down the chords or written down the tune or anything like that. I just sort of remember it. Because when you're writing, I think music is one of those things that's very connected to memory. So when you're writing and when you're sort of just like repeating the same melody and the tune over and over, I think it's easy to recall it. And it's interesting, but I feel like I'm better at remembering melody when I've written it versus trying to remember how to play someone else's song, so like a cover. When I try to remember covers, I'm really, really bad at it. I don't know. It's just interesting. So him and John had this like incredible songwriting chemistry. So they would just sit there with 2 acoustic guitars looking at each other and just sort of like going off of each other's ideas and energy. That's really, really cool. Okay, let's listen a little bit more.
Very quickly under those sort of circumstances.
She loves you, yeah. In a hotel bedroom,
Yeah.
on twin beds with the 2 guitars, and we just had to knock it up it needed a single or something, you know.
Even as young men, did you think you could always pick out your good ones? I mean, or were they all good ones?
Well, I think looking back on the Beatles thing, there was actually quite a few good ones,
Yeah.
you know, that we didn't necessarily think were that good at the time, but some of them that we didn't think were good, I now think are quite good.
Like what?
One thing's with She Loves You.
Right.
I mean, that's quite good. I don't think that was our favourite at the time, but we were trying to write a hit. You know, and you've got to remember, it was very singles orientated in those days. So even though you're making an album, you were actually making an album of singles, one of which or 2 of which would be pulled off and would be your big singles hit. So you were writing quite sort of concise little pieces. And I say we got into the habit of just doing it in one go, hardly ever revisiting it, hardly ever revising the words. And I think it's interesting, if that's how you have to work, that's how you work.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got 2 weeks to do it, that's how you'll work. Well, we didn't. And when we came into the studio, this studio, we had 3 hours in which to do 2 songs.
Right.
You know, finished.
Yeah.
You know, so that would be like Yesterday and Michelle. All finished, you know.
Yesterday's
It's interesting. I wonder if the fact that they just sort of wrote the songs in one go, just in the moment, if that played a role in helping them make such good songs. I know that sounds a bit weird, but something I like to think about and talk about is how when you're writing, if you're forcing ideas and you're thinking too much about it, you're basically trying too hard to get a certain outcome, then it's going to be counterintuitive. But when you just sort of sit down, write the song in that moment, just sort of see where it takes you and do it all even in one sitting, I think that the result could be a lot more intuitive. And music is supposed to be intuitive. It's supposed to be like feelings based and sort of engage emotions. And when you're doing it in that moment, I think the emotion that you put into the song is going to be a lot more powerful and tangible. Versus, let's say I start writing a song, and then the next day I add on a little bit, and the next day, and the next week. I think I might have lost a bit of the original magic from that first moment when I got that spark of inspiration. Because maybe when I started doing it, I was really inspired, but then I'm not really in that moment anymore. So the song might not be as good, and I think it's interesting.
Because there's always the famous example of that being Scrambled Eggs before it was Yesterday.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting because you'd have thought it was such a poignant song that you wouldn't have thought that would work if you were singing or thinking about eggs. But I
got the melody, I got the tune, and then I think it was a sort of young man's way of pretending I wasn't writing a soppy song.
Right.
With a sort of sad song.
So you're being a bit disingenuous, really.
Yeah, just sort of for the mates, scrambled eggs. Oh my baby, I love your legs.
Right, yeah.
But I obviously knew I had to change that. That was just a sort of joke on the way. But I was pleased with the melody, and I had just woken up one morning with it in my head. Couldn't believe it was mine. Went round and checked it with everyone, and nobody knew it.
Well, you sort of sing it to them and say, "Is this from? Have I nicked this off something?"
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. First of all, to John. Yeah. Wait a minute. Look at this. What is it? What is it? I can't. It must be something because I dreamed it. So I automatically assumed it was something I'd heard, and it just come back in a dream. Took it to George Martin. He said, "No, I never heard of it." Took it to a few other friends, and everyone agreed they'd never heard of it. So it was like, okay, it's mine. Then, don't quite know how, but it is. And then someone reminded me recently, I was on a holiday in Portugal and was driving from Lisbon to the south coast, where it was actually Bruce Welch of The Shadows' holiday villa that he was lending me. But I had this big drive, and on the 3-hour drive I started thinking of proper lyrics. So got the Yesterday and the Suddenly.
What he was saying in that little bit is how when he thought of the melody for Yesterday, he didn't have lyrics. He just sort of had like this joking lyrics like scrambled eggs. So he thought that the melody was so good. He woke up with this melody in his head, and he was worried that someone else had already written the melody. And I think that's one of the worst feelings, is when you come up with a melody or song and you're like so worried that, oh gosh, like sometimes it happens where you write a song melody and then you don't know for sure if it's already been written. It's really annoying, but yeah, that's definitely something to think about. It can happen.
and got the real lyrics for it. And Bruce reminded me, actually, that when I got there, I said, have you got a guitar? Have you got a guitar? I hadn't brought mine. He said, yeah. I said, oh, lends it. And I sat down and sort of put it all together with the lyrics.
Right. Yeah, it must have been terrifying if there's no cassettes, that you'd forget it. You'd never get back to it.
But see, this was the thing. It was a kind of terror, but it was a kind of great thing, really, because as we said, if we forget it tomorrow, it's no good. How can we expect our public to remember it if we can't and we only wrote it yesterday? And what you would find would be that you would sort of forget it towards the end of the day and get a little bit panicked. But first thing in the morning, you go, what was that? Oh, yeah. And it would come back. So you'd play it a bit more on the guitar. That was like the way of cementing it in your mind.
So it seems like, from what you're saying, that all the songs, come from one little snippet of an idea, which is then kind of embellished upon. I think I was reading with it, Magical Mystery Tour, when you started that. I think I read somewhere that you started banging out and you just had the first line, roll up for the Mystery Tour, and you were playing it and shouting out snatches of words that Mal Evans was trying to write down as you were going along. Is that really?
Yeah, I mean, we would do all that sort of thing. You try any method, really, Yeah. But normally it's fairly straightforward, and it is just following the muse. You get an idea. And I always say to people, why I still do it. Some people say, why do you still do it? You've written so many songs. I said, well, I love it. And, if they sacked me tomorrow, I would wake up and write a song.
Yeah.
Just because they'd sacked me.
It's what you did.
And it's what I do, and it's what I love to do. And why I love to do it is because I don't know the process. I don't quite understand what happens. And that's really nice for me.
And I've often seen people talk about the craft of...
Okay, so here's another little bit of insight, as he talks about how he's following the muse. And this is interesting, because the muse is the songwriting inspiration. It's, that little bit of insight, that little bit of an idea that makes you want to write a song. I think that's one of the coolest and, just an awesome feeling when you have an idea and it just kind of comes to you, and then it's a bit magical. And if you're a songwriter, you know what I'm talking about. It's just you get this feeling. Sometimes you get even goosebumps. You just have this insight, and then you need to write the song. And the other thing he mentions is how why he does it is because he loves it, first of all, but also that he doesn't quite understand the process. And there's a bit of a magic to it. And yeah, we can discuss skills and we can discuss the craft aspect of it all day, but at the end of the day, there is some magic to making art in general. But I think there's a specific magic to music, for sure.
Of songwriting, which sounds a bit like an academic exercise.
Yeah.
So you just like to fling yourself at it.
It's how I've always been, yeah. It's the same with singing, and in a way, it's kind of dangerous, because it might be a bit more comfortable to feel like I knew something about it. I've got a lot of friends whose biggest fear is being found out, and they're very famous and very talented, but there's still this little sort of edge of panic at the back of it, which probably keeps you sort of, wanting to do it.
Yeah. Who are the I know another song you're doing is...
Okay, I love that. That even Paul McCartney is one of the greatest songwriters of all time. And other famous musicians, they don't necessarily understand how songwriting works. I don't. And I talk about it a lot. And I think about it a lot. But I think it's just kind of one of those great mysteries. And if you're a songwriter, pretty new to songwriting, I think knowing that we don't necessarily know what we're doing, we're just sort of going with the flow, and we're going in the moment, and we're just following the muse and the inspiration, you will feel a lot less scared. At least you'll be comfortable knowing that you're not alone in feeling like, oh God, I'm an imposter. What if they find out that I don't actually understand music theory? I don't. I mean, I kind of do. I try to, but I really don't. I think music theory for me and for some people, for some songwriters, it's kind of like putting a name to something that you can't really name. And yeah, it's useful to look at, it's helpful, but at the end of the day, like what actually makes you write the song and what makes it work and what makes it good, that's the mystery. That's like the magic of it.
Pleased with it. Do you know what? I always think that was one of the good things about the Beatles, that 4 people had to sign off on it. Actually 5 with George Martin. And his 5 good heads had to like this song before the public even got to hear it. Which is actually quite a nice quality control if you think about it, you know.
Yeah, I think that's something I don't know as much about, is collaborating with a band. I don't really have a band that I collaborate with at the moment, at least. And there are some songwriters who like to write completely independently and they do the arrangement all on their own. But I think that there's some merit to having someone there who can sort of peer review what you're writing and say, you know what, like, I don't like that at all. And I think, even though I like to talk about how I don't think competition is necessarily the healthiest way to see music, I think a little bit of healthy competition is useful in sort of upping your game and, you know, writing that even better song. So the Beatles are interesting because they did have that really strong collaboration and even competition amongst themselves, amongst John, amongst Paul specifically. And I think that made their music so great, at least part of why it was so great. Because I think that their music was pretty innovative. God, I can't speak, but you get the point. And yeah, I think that was a really brilliant interview, just listening to Paul talk about songwriting, just how he doesn't necessarily have a method and he just sort of does it. And I think that's the best way to go about creating music. Yeah, so the main kind of thing that I took away is how he's not trying to have a method. And that's definitely in line with the things that I'm trying to sort of discuss on this series, is how, yeah, there are little tricks and tips you can follow, but at the end of the day, you just gotta sit down and do it. You just gotta write the music and not try too hard at the same time. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe for more videos on music, the creative process, and specifically songwriting. Thanks for watching.